I started by using the Quick Select tool to create a good outline of Polly's portrait. I then created a layer mask onto the portrait of Polly and created a new layer. I dragged the new layer down so it was underneath Polly's portrait and filled it in with white using the bucket tool. I then had 5 or 6 images to use to create background with by layering them up to create a whole new background image. I used one of Polly, which is her from behind, stretching up with happiness. So I went and edited that, cleaned it up a little bit. I then had a play around with the background images to see what would look good and how I could edit them together to create a surreal area of nature. I then went back to the portrait and cleaned up the edges using the brush tool on black with the layer mask selected. I then dragged Polly's portrait onto the background image. I then changed the opacity of the portrait image so that I could see the background through it, and then I adjusted it to see how it could fit together to create a good composition. I wasn't happy with the composition of the first image, so I tried another one. Doing the same thing again to get the 2 images to line up nicely. I changed the opacity and adjusted the brightness and contrast. I wanted a beautiful, almost surreal look to my image. The sky wasn't as blue and clear as I wanted, so I used the erase tool on a softened brush setting to erase the sky of the image. I then went back and readjusted the brightness, contrast, hue, saturation and colour balance. I then went to another image that I took and dragged it onto the piece in progress. I used this for the sky as it was nice and bright and blue. I then adjusted the hue and saturation of the bottom image to match the top image. I put the opacity down so I could stretch and adjust the top image to fit well with the other. I brought the opacity back up. I then brought layer 0 to the top so that layer 2 was behind it. I then merged the hue, saturation, brightness, etc. with layer 0 so they didn't affect the other layers. I then brought the opacity back up to 100% and then got rid of the white glow around the trees using the erase tool on layer 0, which is now called brightness contrast 1. Once I was happy with the background, I then dragged the long shot of Polly onto the image. I then adjusted the size of Polly compared to the background to try and make it look like she was really there. I then tried to create a shadow by adding a brightness/contrast layer and turning it down to dark. I then took the erase tool on the brightness/contrast layer and erased everywhere that I didn't want shadow to appear. I also adjusted the brightness to try and match the tree's shadow. I then clicked on the portrait layer again to make it reappear, and then I played around with the opacity. On the portrait layer, I clicked at the top, layer, adjust, and then desaturate to make it black and white. I then went onto the portrait layer, brought the opacity all the way back up, and just used the stamp tool on a soft brush setting to get rid of all the harsh lines of Polly's top. I then brought all of my images back to view and adjusted the opacity again on the portrait layer. I didn't like where Polly was, she didn't stand out, so I then tried to figure out how to make her stand out a bit more in the image. I tried moving her across a bit, and then I had to get rid of the brightness layer which created the shadows. I then dragged her so that she was sort of in the sky. This didn't look realistic as she wasn't standing on anything, but I thought it looked good that her arms were really defined and you could clearly see that it was a person. I then got rid of the shadow that I created as that was not relevant anymore, and looked through the pictures that I had taken to see if there was anything I could use to help make the image fit well. I needed to make her look like she was standing on something, possibly a hill I was thinking. I then came across this image which had a really nice branch in it. I thought I could make it look like she was in the tree. So using that other image with the branch, I managed to add it into the edit. I dragged it from the album, adjusted it and changed the opacity to fit it well so that Polly was standing on the branch. I rasterized the layer so that I could erase away what I didn't want in the image. I brought the opacity back up and cleaned up the image using the erase tool on a soft brush setting. The more layers I added, I found gave the image good depth. I zoomed into Polly's feet and cleaned it up with the erase tool. Once it was all tidied up, I then decided to adjust the portrait of Polly to improve the composition of the image. I didn't like the trees behind Polly as it took the attention away, so I used the erase tool to get rid of them, so then Polly stood out more. I then had to duplicate the layer of the sky and pulled it down a bit just to fill in the area where I'd erased the trees. Once I was happy with the image as a whole, I then saved the file as both a JPEG and a Photoshop project just in case I needed to go back and edit it again.